Okay, hello everyone. My name is Michael Downey and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's AWRI webinar. Today's session has been organised in response to recent reports of frost in a number of wine grape growing regions and will include management strategies to be used before and after a frost event. I'm lucky to have joining me Sonja Needs from the University of Melbourne. Sonja has led research investigating strategies to improve management of frost-affected grapevines, and it is a great pleasure to have her expertise and practical advice on hand. Sonja's presentation will be followed by a Q&A, and for those in the audience, I'd like to invite you to join the conversation. To ask a question, please open the Q&A section of the webinar, type in your questions and click to send. If you'd like to get involved through Twitter, please use the Twitter handle @_AWRI. As always, this webinar is being recorded and will be available to view via the AWRI's YouTube channel later this afternoon. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Wine Australia for providing funding and support for AWRI webinars. For those of you just joining us, welcome. Today's topic is managing frosted grapevines, and I'll hand over now to our speaker, Sonja Needs, to start the conversation.
Hi everyone, and welcome and thank you for joining us. I'll be talking about managing your vineyard after a frost. We're going to break this webinar down into a few little areas. So we'll talk a little bit about what a frost does, and then I'll be talking about frost preparation, and then we'll be talking about post-frost management, which is what most of you, I think, will be joining us to hear. Climate change is an interesting one. We're thinking about a warming climate, and a lot of people are thinking in a warming climate, you would be expecting perhaps less frost, but the increased temperatures induced by climate change are advancing our phenology. Most of us know that. About 30% of the advancement in phenology is due to climate change. The rest is due to management. And that causes our bud burst to be a little earlier. Now, that earlier bud burst really affects the timing of when we have grapevines susceptible to frost is moving earlier into the season. So the elevated temperatures basically are also expected to cause drier spring conditions for most of Australia's grape-growing regions. And of course, ideal conditions for a frost is dry grounds, clear skies, and less wind. So to get a perfect storm for a frost is if you've got very dry conditions with absolute clear skies and no wind, and you're much more likely to get a frost. You won't get a frost if you've got a heavy cloud cover. You won't get a frost the day after rain either. So those dry spring conditions are most likely to increase the occurrence of frost, and there's been research done on this just recently, actually showing that for most regions, not every region, but most regions, you'll be looking at climate change won't be decreasing the risk of frost. The advanced phenology during the spring frost basically exposes our grapevines to frost at those critical growing periods as well. And we'll talk about when and what that is in a second. So a few frost facts. When you are looking at forecast temperatures from the Bureau of Meteorology or wherever you get your temperature forecast from, the forecast temperatures are taken at 1.3 metres above the ground, which is pretty much canopy height for most vineyards. In a radiation frost, the air cools from the ground up. So the temperature at ground level is always going to be cooler than the temperature at that 1.3 metres above the ground. When the ground temperature is 0, typically it's about 2 degrees at canopy height. And leaf, shoot, cane and trunk temperatures are generally colder than air temperature, and they can be up to 3 degrees colder, and that depends on the positioning of the leaves and the shoots. So horizontal leaves tend to be colder than vertical leaves, and that really just has to do with radiation. So critical temperatures is an interesting one. So when there is a frost during that growing period of development, damage is much more likely to occur at the EL 7 to 16 stage. Damage can occur to grapevines in temperatures as high as minus 0.5. So most of us think about damage occurring at exactly on 0, but grapevines are a little bit tolerable to that. And you start to see a little bit of damage at that sort of minus 0.5. Once you get to minus 1 and definitely minus 2, you're going to see damage occurring at a greater rate. Grapevines recover from frost generally by growing secondary shoots, but as most of you would be aware, secondary shoots are always considered to be less fruitful than the original primary shoots. And so damage at this sort of EL 7 to 16 stage, most of our buds have got laterals and other shoots that they can push through. So flowering can be severely retarded if a frost occurs and the flower buds are damaged. And I know that in some areas, this recent frost that we've just had has really damaged a lot of the inflorescences. And so that's going to be an interesting time. So critical temperatures. When I'm talking about critical temperatures, I'm talking about the temperature at which damage starts to occur. And this varies between cultivars and also between studies. So it varies between studies because it depends on how the studies, how the research has been done. And of course it varies between cultivars, and anyone who's growing multiple varieties will know that some varieties are more susceptible to others. And some of that is not necessarily to do with the variety, but to do with the EL stage, the growing stage. So some varieties are earlier than others. Some of it is to do with leaf thickness as well. So, and whether the leaves have protection. So this is a little summary of a couple of studies that were done. You can see it's Pinot Noir and Concord. Of course, most of these studies have been done in America. So Concord being a major variety over there. Nothing on Shiraz at the moment. We may be looking at, we might have to publish some information that we have on Shiraz in the next 6 months or so. So what you'll see, the woody tissue and dormant bud stage, grapevines are extremely tolerant to cold temperatures, even at that sort of woolly bud stage. But once you get to bud burst, we're much more likely to start seeing damage. So if you look at bud burst, if T0 is no damage occurring, so for even Pinot Noir, which is quite a sensitive variety, we're not getting any damage at -1. We're looking at, if you're looking at T10, which is when Concord was looked at, so 10, that's 10% of the vines are damaged, -3.9 for Pinot Noir. At bud burst, for 50% of the vine being affected, -2.2. So, and 90% of the vines being protected or affected on Concord grapes. At bud burst, we're looking at -8.9. So that's quite tolerable at that stage. But really what I want you to look at is Pinot Noir. So we'll have a look just here at 50% affected. And what we were looking at is this sort of later stage, because the frost that's just recently occurred has been at that later stage. So fourth leaf, and most of you would have been affected. Your vines were much further along even than this. But you can see at this fourth leaf stage, is the vines are actually more susceptible as you get more leaves on. So -1.2. So as the vines mature a little bit, they get much more susceptible, and then once the leaves start to harden, and then they're right. In the literature, This is work done, this first piece of literature was work done by Mike Taut from New Zealand and Lida as well. Quite a long time ago, Lida did it. So Mike found that susceptibility to frost and recovery after frost really vary greatly between cultivars, but there are really few studies done on the major varieties grown in Australia and in fact New Zealand as well. So most of the studies are done on Concord, and Zinfandel is quite a lot. There are studies on Pinot Noir and some on Chardonnay, but nothing significant done on Shiraz. Not much done on Cabernet Sauvignon, surprisingly so. The Winkler paper talked about varieties that were bearing well with short spur pruning, being able to produce almost a full crop when shoots are entirely killed by frost. So that seems quite hopeful. Other literature doesn't exactly support that, and my research doesn't entirely support that either. If you've got a variety that is bearing well with short spur pruning, so which is pretty much all of our Australian cultivars, it won't produce a full crop. We're much more likely to see a partial crop come back, and that's mainly because of lateral shoot growth, and those lateral shoots actually bearing fruit from those secondary shoots. So recovery from frost is also dependent on those secondary shoot fruitfulness, and that varies greatly between cultivars. And it's also quite poorly understood. There's been some research out of New Zealand looking at, of course, Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay, and some also looking at Pinot Noir. But yeah, the amount of crop that you get after a frost is going to depend on those secondary shoots, because that's what your vines will now be actually putting their energy into, producing secondary shoots to replace the shoots that have been damaged. So when we think about frost, there's 10 nervous weeks that our vines tend to be susceptible to frost. So in September, so from that bud burst stage where we're EL 4 to 7, as you were talking about earlier, at critical temperatures 4, so at EL 3 and earlier, the vines are quite resistant to frost at that stage. So between EL 4 and 7, our vines start to become susceptible. And we get a high frost occurrence in that time, but buds and leaves are much more tolerable of the cold. October, which is really the critical time where we've got that shoot and inflorescence development, so EL stages 7 through to 18. October is probably the worst time to get a frost, and even worse that first week in November. So this is our most vulnerable time, when the shoot and inflorescence development is happening. So in 2006, we had on the 21st and 22nd of October, a really terrible evection frost come through, mostly Victoria. I think South Australia was hit a little bit with that as well, and certainly up into the Canberra district. In 2013, we had a frost occurred on the 14th, 15th, 18th and 25th of October, right through Victoria, again up into New South Wales, Canberra and the New South Wales districts of regions of wine were hit quite badly in 2013. And of course now we have this in 2017, the 4th of November. All of these frosts were the worst possible time to get a frost. In November, and we normally say by Melbourne Cup Day, which this year was on the 6th of November, traditionally it's the last frost and you can start to breathe easy. So any frost before Melbourne Cup Day tends to be damaging. We tend not to get frosts. Historically, we don't tend to get any frosts after about that first week in November. So unfortunately this year, to get a frost on the 4th of November is really bad luck. So let's have a little bit talk about preparing for frost. Now I know for a lot of you it's a little late, but I want you to start thinking about the future. So the first thing is pruning. So in spur prune vines, employ late spur pruning to delay bud break. So if you've got frost susceptible vineyards, and I know also with this frost, the interesting thing with it is that a lot of vineyards were hit that have never been frosted before. Just the type of frost it is weather conditions. There's so much that affects where and when a frost will hit, and we will talk about this as we go on. But yes, in spur prune vines, you can employ late spur pruning to delay bud break. That just gives you a little bit less time in that susceptible phase. In cane prune vines, if you've got a very susceptible block, you can use kicker canes, which may or may not be used in the event of a frost. So they allow you to have sort of additional shoot selection if a frost occurs. If you don't get a frost, you can just go through and cut them off, prune them off. Leaving additional canes post-pruning is also handy in cane prune vines. It may or may not be used in the event of a frost. If you get a frost, it just gives you additional shoot selection to optimize vine yield. So if you don't get a frost, again, you can just go through summer pruning and get rid of those additional canes. But if you do get a frost, it may give you a few more shoots to select. Cover crops and ground preparation is one of the really, really important things that is easily done. Particularly if you are looking and you are monitoring your weather and you know that there is going to be a frost occur, there are some things that you can do. So the minimum temperature is affected by soil texture and soil water content. Now, I know, again, a few of you are thinking our soil was actually moist. We've had good rain this year, and there has been moist soil, but if you've got if you have got a frost coming, if you can put an irrigation down and get that soil as wet as possible, that will definitely give you a few degrees, so up to 2 degrees protection. Peat and sandy soils don't store or conduct heat, as well as loam or clay soils. So this is one of the reasons you sometimes will see in vineyards areas affected and areas not so much affected. If you look at soil maps, you may find that the soil type can be a little different throughout the vineyard, and that will make a difference because it's what we're looking at is during the day the ground is absorbing the sun's rays, absorbing heat, and the more heat that can be stored in the soil, the longer it's going to take for that vineyard to get cold. So moist soil will conduct heat better than dry soil. So a frost hazard is lower if the moist soil compared to dry soil. So the other one that's really important is to ensure that any of your cover crops, your inter-row herbage, is closely mown and soils are moist and also firm. Some of the best things you can do if you have a vineyard that is getting hit, particularly if you get regular frost in a vineyard or you know that a vineyard's susceptible to frost, one of the best things that I have seen for fairly passive frost protection is actually grazing sheep in your vineyard. They compact the soils a little bit. They will eat down your cover crop really low to the ground, and if you can then keep the ground moist as well, that gives you quite a bit of frost protection. Sheep are really good at getting those cover crops low while still compacting the soil just that little bit. Cultivated soils and deep inter-row herbage tend to provide an insulated layer, and I'm going to show you a picture in a minute, to the soil surface. So because they're insulating the soil to the sun during the day, the soil's not able to store as much heat and therefore isn't able to re-radiate that heat at night. So the more open your ground is to the, or your soil is to the sun, the better. And this is a nice little picture showing, this is a mowed lawn, and you can see on the right it's extremely low and not affected by frost, and on the left That little bit higher, not that much higher, but that little bit higher, and you can see how the frost has affected that slightly higher grass. Now that purely is a picture of how the thicker, higher grass on the left-hand side provides insulation to the soil and therefore doesn't allow that re-radiation of heat, and we get that sort of frost. It's a nice illustration of what I was just talking about. Cold air drainage is something that people either know about or they don't. So it's important, and I think it's something that you can do quite easily in vineyards that are affected by frost if you know what to look for and what to do. So the air is subject to the laws of thermodynamics and hydraulics. And I like to think of cold air moving and acting a lot like water. Cold air is dense, so it's denser than warm air. It tends to sit below warm air. Warm air rises, cold air tends to fall. And it falls and it moves like water. It will roll downhill, it will accumulate in hollows, and it will actually, like water, follow drainage areas. So it flows downhill, it tends to sit at the lowest available point, it'll accumulate until dispersed basically by heat or wind. So even on a still night, there is air movement on slopes. So if you walk outside, still nights is when we get frosts. Cold air is not moved by the wind, it is literally moved by equilibrizing and radiation. So as air cools, it drops down. As things warm up, they move up, and that causes movement of air. If you're thinking about which direction does frost come from, I walked outside and I could feel the wind on my face, so it must come from this direction. That's not necessarily the case, because sometimes what you feel on your face is not the air movement direction when you go a meter above the ground or at ground level. Steeper slopes tend to cause air to move faster. Again, just purely that laws of thermodynamics and hydraulics. Water runs downhill, so does cold air. It tends to roll down the hill. And the steeper the hill, the faster it will move. It takes energy to move air through and around obstructions, and therefore cold air often accumulates above obstacles. Now, you would be surprised at how cold air can actually stack up against tree lines, bushes and grass, which we would think the air would just move straight through. It's not watertight. Air sits and is held quite well by vegetation. So there are basically three things you can do to help air drainage. Remove obstacles to air drainage. So most of you would probably have topography maps of your vineyard, and most of you would know your vineyards if you're walking through them, where the hills are, where the slopes are, where you've got depressions in the vineyard. So walk around your vineyard and have a look. Have a look at where you think the air might move. And if you are trying to picture if you had a flood go through, where would the water roll? Where would it collect? So think about water, and that will help you think about air movement. So removing obstacles to air drainage. So things like if you've got a vineyard that's got a slight slope, and at the bottom of that slope there is a fence that has high grass growing along that fence line, mow the grass, whippersnipper it, get rid of it, to allow the cold air to drain through that fence. If you've got a tree line or hedges or anything at the bottoms of your slope, if that vineyard is susceptible to frost, clear that herbage away from that area. Maintain drainage ways in good condition. So if you are going to create a cold air drainage area, make sure that during that spring, those 10 weeks, September through to the first week in November, that everything is maintained and in good condition. You can also create cold air storage off-site or away from your vineyard, so you can literally create drainage like you would for water, and actually direct where you want the cold air to go, and then have it drop off into a paddock or drainage area, literally water drainage areas, so that the cold air runs away from your vineyard. This is a pretty wordy slide, this one, but we'll go through it pretty quickly. So places to clear, tree lines and woodlots, in or crossing air drainways. You can bulldoze out humps or earth dams, so areas in your vineyard that there's little lumps and humps in your vineyard. Grab a bulldozer, flatten them out. Thin out the cold air layer by increasing drainage, so help increase airflow by decreasing friction. So again, keep your cover crops low. Make slopes steeper where it's practical. If you've got a vineyard that slowly slopes away and the bottom of the vineyard is affected by frost, you might literally dig away an area to make a bit of a gully or a moat. Open up restrictions if you can, so trimming understories, making sure that hedgerows and things like that are removed, trimming down grass that's leaning up against fences. For good cold air drainage, you need an opening of 20 metres or more, so it's quite wide. So 20 metres is the minimum width for good airflow. So the larger the area draining through, the wider that opening should be. You can also not just drain the air, but you can actually obstruct the air from moving into a vineyard. So solid obstructions block airflow. So you can, things like fences, but again, tree lines and bushes, and even just having a fence that you literally let the grass grow up high, will basically cause an obstruction. And you can obstruct the air from moving into your vineyard or use an obstruction to direct air around a vineyard. Warm air, the cool air actually will pile up behind the obstruction, and it piles up quite high. So you don't need a high obstruction to pile up quite a lot of a lot of cold air. But yes, you can use tree lines and grass and things like that to actually direct cold air as well away from your vineyard. This is a nice picture provided by Marty Longbottom, thank you very much. This shows pathway. So if we're having a look here, this area here, just have a look here. This is a wind turbine or a wind fan used for a frost protection fan. And you can see this is a pretty devastating picture, really. You can see the frost where the vineyards have been affected by frost all through here. This vineyard here really terribly. This area here, a low spot in this area, and you can see how badly this has been affected by frost. And you can see this frost fan here, how it has actually protected these vineyards through here. Now, what I want you to take note of is this tree line and the road. And you can see as the frost has come through here, on a couple of the other photos that we were looking at, like this, you can see how protected these vineyards are. Now, it was thought that the frost actually came in from the east, which was the bottom of this picture, and moving up. But just looking at this picture, I would suspect that it's either come in from the north or the south rather than the east, and it's rolled in. And this tree line really has protected these vineyards along this area here. This frost fan, you can see how well the frost fans actually worked along here as well, how well it's worked to protect this vineyard. Okay. So monitoring is super important in your vineyard as well. So temperature loggers, if you don't have them in your vineyard, you should get them out there. They're not that expensive. The technology nowadays is really easy, and it's actually quite cheap. So temperature loggers or thermometers in the vineyard so that you can get an accurate picture of what the temperature is. Particularly looking at not just have one thermometer in a vineyard. To have a thermometer, look at your topography in your vineyard, make sure you got thermometers in your low areas and in your high areas so you know the differences in your vineyard throughout the season. It's helpful not just for frost, but for just management in general. So lower areas tend to be colder, so make sure the thermometer is at the same height of the canopy that you want to protect. Don't put the thermometers on the trellising posts below the canopy. So put your loggers in at canopy height. Monitor temperatures to predict whether the radiation frost is likely to occur. There's lots of methods available. I'm not going to go through them at the moment. You can Google how to predict a frost. There's a few books out there. I'm pretty sure AWRI would have some information on that. And it basically, if you know your dew point and you know what the temperature of your vineyard is at certain points, you can predict very accurately not only if you're going to get a frost, but what time during the night that frost will actually occur. And that's super, super important when we're thinking about frost protection as well. So let's go on and have a talk about frost protection. So different things that we can do. Helicopters, most of us helicopters are well and truly not an economically viable solution, but they're there. Fans, of course, overhead sprinklers, misters and foggers, heaters, and burning things like hay bales. So they're probably the main 6 things that you can do that are actually an active strategy to prevent frost. So helicopters, they're expensive. Ideally, they need temperature loggers within the vineyard. I don't know whether any of you have been to New Zealand. In Marlborough, they have a light system, like a traffic light system, that help direct the helicopters that they use there. With the helicopters, you need to start early, so well and truly before the frost has occurred, because if you are late and that the vineyard is starting to really cool down, you can actually make things worse, because your vines will they'll start to super cool, which is a self-protection method, and if you then upset the canopy and make it move, you can actually cause like a snap frost throughout the vineyard. So making sure if you're using helicopters that you use them early, and the earlier, the longer time they're in the air, of course, the more expensive they are. Fans are great if you've got the right topography and they're placed correctly. So that previous photo that we showed you earlier, that fan was placed really lovely. It would have been nice if there was several of them throughout that region, but that fan, of course, was placed quite nicely. So there's an initial cost, of course, with frost fans, and again, an ongoing cost to run. They have to be checked regularly. There's no point having them if the day that you need them, you turn them on and realize they're not going to work. And some councils also don't allow frost fans because of the noise, particularly if you're near a residential area. Inverted sink fans are a fairly mobile, different way to do the same sort of job. So basically what they do is they suck the cold air away. So again, it sort of works with that cold air drainage. If they have to be correctly placed, but they'll suck the cold air away and push it back out up through the top, and they cause movement of the air as well. So they can work quite effectively, again, if you have the correct topography and you get them in the right, if you place them right in the vineyard. Overhead sprinklers and misters is probably one of the most common types of frost protection that we use. But again, it has to be done right. So getting the timing right for switching them on. So if you, again, are too late, you can actually make things worse. Of course, they use water, so you have to have water available as well. They need to be maintained. So often we're looking at overhead sprinklers that we would only use for frost protection, or misters that we would only use for frost protection. So during or before the frost season hits, we need to go through and make sure that they are actually working correctly. And for the type of watering that you're using, or irrigation that you're using for protection, you need to know the correct rate of water to be applied for the sprinkler size. So you can apply too much, you can apply too little. And again, it's just getting that timing right. Heaters or burning, so things like burning hay bales or using 40-gallon drums. Again, it's a fairly, it's not a bad way if you have got no other frost protection and you think, I'm going to get a frost and what can I do straight away? Something that you can do. Needs to be monitored all night. It's not something you can put out and then go to bed. It can use a large amount of fuel, so you have to be prepared for that. Again, correct placement and spacing is super, super important. And again, also, there's maybe council regulations, particularly with burning hay bales. And if you have got a residential area close to your vineyard, it can really be restricted. Moving into that sort of November time period as well, there's also fire restrictions for some regions. Okay, let's go into the bit that most of you probably are mostly interested in, which is our post-frost management. So there are two economic factors that will influence what sort of management you're going to apply after a frost. So the first is whether there's a crop worthy of normal culture. So you've got to look at how badly have I been frosted and am I going to get enough fruit from this crop this year to continue on as normal. And if the crop level is going to be so low that only vineyard maintenance efforts are justified. Now, if you're not going to get a crop from your vineyard for the year, that doesn't mean you just walk away and leave your vineyard, because you need to start straight away thinking about next year. So from all the work that I have done, there's not much evidence that post-frost management makes difference in yield or quality. There's no silver bullet spray that you can put on that's going to increase your yield or your quality. And there's not a lot that you can do really that is going to be effective in changing the amount of yield or quality that you're going to get this year. So what do you need to do? Pruning should be taken into account, so whether you're cane or spur pruned. So keeping that in mind, cane prune vines need to be managed to prevent excess lateral growth, because you want to be thinking about healthy canes for the following season, and that's super important. In spur prune vines, remember that tertiary and secondary and tertiary buds on the spurs, they're usually about 50 to 70% as productive as the primary buds, but they will give you some fruit for the year. Also with those secondary and tertiary buds, the fruit on that is never going to be of as good a quality as you would get on primary shoots. We're far enough into the season now that any secondary and tertiary shoots that come through now, any fruit that comes through, there's not going to be any more frosts for this year. So we don't have to worry about that. This is a trial that I did 10 years ago now. So we had 2 sites of Chardonnay. We applied 3 treatments. Our first treatment was basically nothing. We just let the vines do their thing. We did nothing to them. The second treatment we did, we removed the damaged tissue, and a lot of people, you may have already gone through and removed damaged tissue, whether it just be wiping it off or pruning. Our third treatment was to remove the shoot back to the cordon, so cutting them right back. And you can see these pictures here. This was our no management treatment. Remove the damaged tissue, so you can see there was still quite a few leaves, and about a third of these shoots were left. And this was our third treatment, where we've basically cut back to the spur. And this is the sort of results that we got. So in our no management treatment, we got a much bigger yield, kilo per vine. The bome was not affected. So the bome throughout the treatments was not affected, and we harvested at the same time. The bunch weight was, well, not much difference between the treatment 3 and the no treatment, but a little different with the damaged tissue. Total bunches was really different. Now, this is mostly due to that lateral growth, and we'll talk about this in a second. But the total shoots in the end wasn't different either. What most of you will be looking at is the profit per hectare for the treatments, and you'll see that for the no management treatment, it was double, so more than double. And that is mostly due to the cost of actually implementing treatment. So the yield was more than double in the do nothing treatment. And it was primarily due to the large number of lateral shoots bearing fruit. So these Chardonnay vines, they literally pushed out a huge amount of lateral shoots, and all of them had 1 to 3 bunches. Each bunch, they weren't as large as a primary bunch would have been, bunches of fruit on unaffected vines, but they still had fruit. The shoot number showed little difference between treatments, and there was no significance during ripening. So everything ripened at the same time, which was almost surprising, I think. And the profit in the do nothing treatment was more than double, and that was mostly due to saving of labour costs, but also the fact that the yield was higher. If you're looking at perhaps not having an economic crop this year, you still will be needing to think about what you're going to do for next year, and what you do now will affect your yield for 2019. So we had a look at how the treatments affected the pruning and the viability of the buds for the following year. We found with the no management treatment, the wood, when it was removed, there was significant damage in a lot of those canes. You could see the frost damage throughout the canes when we removed them. The spurs were not as strong, so they tended to be very thin, like pencil thickness or even less. The bud viability was variable, and it was quite difficult to get a good spur selection. So what we ended up having was sort of spurs on spurs on spurs, so quite a messy vine at the end of the season. With the removing the damaged tissue, the wood was of really good quality. So we sort of removed all the damaged wood, and we were left with healthy wood. Spur selection was variable. The bud viability was good. But again, the positioning for the spur selection was difficult as well. Again, spur on spur. So for the last treatment, the removing the damaged tissue back to the cordon, the wood was really healthy. The spurs were great. They were nice, thick, healthy spurs that we ended up with. The bud viability was really good, and the positioning was excellent. So a little bit more about that. So the quality of the pruning material was significantly better in the remove shoot to the cordon treatment. And interestingly, the time it took to prune the vines wasn't significantly different, even though it was much more difficult to select healthy, well-positioned spurs on the do nothing treatment. With an experienced pruner, it only made seconds worth of difference. So it was a bit more of a thinking exercise, but it really didn't make much difference to the time. The bud fruitfulness wasn't affected significantly, but yeah, there was some differences in the viability of the buds. So, in conclusion, so after a severe frost, which is what I think a lot of you listening have had this year, consider doing nothing. I know that is not what a lot of you want to hear, but sometimes the money that you would be spending on cure-all sprays and sending teams of people out into the vineyard to prune and to manage, that money might be better off spent on a really good bottle of scotch. Secondary growth is not as fruitful, but it may produce some crops, so it is worth waiting. Be aware that, of course, your harvest dates are going to be quite affected, so at least by usually 4 to 6 weeks. So harvest date will be much later in the season this year in those blocks that have been affected by frost. If you've had a lighter frost, or in areas that the frost is lighter, you may think about pruning to even up the growth, because again, what you're going to have to do if you've got blocks that have been partially affected, be really aware that you're going to get, in those blocks, the areas that are not affected, you're going to get good primary fruit that is going to ripen much earlier than the areas that were affected by frost. So marking out the areas that were affected by frost, you may actually, even if you're going to run harvesters through, if you're machine harvesting to make things easier, you may, if you don't want that secondary fruit, if you're worried about the quality of it, you may actually just summer prune, thin it out. Watch for damaged inflorescences. If you've got lots of inflorescences that are damaged, that may make a difference to if you've got some inflorescences damaged on one vine and some that are not, again, you're going to get that uneven ripening. So you may go through and actually, if you've got new inflorescences coming through in the next few weeks, and you've got some inflorescences on the same vine that were not affected, and they're now starting to, they've been fertilized, they flower, they fertilize, you may want to remove those inflorescences that are coming through on the secondary shoots, so you don't have that uneven yielding, and that will make a difference too. Watch for botrytis. I think most of the blocks that were affected have actually dried off pretty well, but early on, certainly after a frost, quite often the leaves and the shoots, they're quite wet. They look soggy, and often they will drop down and you will see leaves that will actually be touching undamaged inflorescences, but those leaves then they start to rot if you don't get enough heat or wind, and that can cause botrytis within the bunches, so that can be a real problem. Just a few pictures of frost that's happened at different EL stages. So this is Chardonnay with frost affected at EL stage 9. This is Chardonnay again affected at 13, and you can see here the inflorescence has been affected, and this whole shoot basically has been frosted. And this is at EL 15, and again, this is one of my trial sites, and you can see with this, the frosts come down, and really unfortunately for this block, the frost affected basically to the first bunches, and then just those first few leaves below that weren't affected. So all the inflorescences were affected with this. And this next picture, quite a few of you will have vineyards that are looking almost along this side. This is a Sauv Blanc at EL 27. So again, all the inflorescences you can see have been affected. This even starting to get stuff that looked a little bit more like fruit. And yeah, quite affected by frost. So I'm just going to go back to I'll just go back to conclusions for a second. The other thing that I'd really like to add to this is that even if you're not going to get a significant yield this year, please keep up your fertilizing regime that you would normally do. Keep up your spray regime that you would normally do. Just monitor your vineyard like normal. So you may not invest as much money as you might if you were getting off a normal yield this year, but you must still maintain sprays to make sure that you're not going to get downy and powdery or botrytis, and you need to maintain fertiliser so that your vines are able to, when they go into dormancy at the winter next year, that they've got enough carbohydrate reserves to push through for the following season. So that being said, you don't really need to go through and put on any special fertilizers or sprays, I think, at this stage. Most of your vines would have been had a bit of fertilizer by now, and hopefully they'll have enough to sustain them. If you think that your vines need a little bit more fertilizer, of all means, go ahead and do that. Okay, so we might have a look at some questions.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Sonja. As Sonja's just indicated, we will move straight into a Q&A from here. I see that some of you have already started to send in some questions through the chat part of the webinar, and that's good. But could you please use the Q&A box rather than the chat to send in your questions?
I'll do this
one. Okay, so first question we've got here: if doing nothing is the recommendation and we want to encourage lateral growth, should we give a boost of nitrogen and perhaps irrigate if needed?
And the answer to that would be yes. So if you want to encourage that lateral growth, you can certainly a little bit of nitrogen just to push through. Again, fertilizing too much is like taking multivitamins when you don't need it. If the plants don't need it, they won't take it up. Particularly, you can over fertilize, of course, and cause toxicity, but it won't hurt to a little bit of boost of nitrogen. Irrigate, certainly if your vines are dry, irrigate like you would at basically at bud burst. So yeah.
Okay, thanks for your question there, Paul. Another question here. If you go back to the aerial photo, you'll see another wind fan about halfway out and a long green unaffected area streaming out to the north, reinforcing your point.
Yeah, so that's interesting, because if the wind fan, if you have that, it's unaffected to the north, makes you think that maybe that cool air is coming through the south. Yeah. So one of the questions, I'll do this one, Sam Ward, said, is spraying out mid-rows completely effective? If it looks, open soil definitely is going to take up the radiation, the heat radiation, better than covered. So the moment you put a cover crop on, it provides insulation. But the cover crops are effective for lots of other reasons. So if you've got a very frost affected vineyard, one that's regularly affected by frost, yeah, definitely removing your mid-rows in those areas, whether it be at the whole vineyard or just through the area that is frost affected, is definitely going to help. And also making sure that the soil in those areas is a bit more compacted. Don't turn your soil over. So just moving the tractors up and down helps with that. A little bit of compaction through that soil definitely helps. So Ursula Kennedy, hi Ursula, has asked, I've heard a few people using an eco-carb seaweed fish extract type spray as a preventative. Any thoughts? Yes, we have actually done some research on this. It's not published yet. It doesn't hurt, can I say? I'm not going to say definitively that it's going to help. There's lots of different mechanisms and different things that spraying sort of those ecocarb, seaweed, fish extract type sprays affect. A lot of them has to do with the bacterial loads on the plants. So look, it won't hurt, but you have to have the timing right. Like a lot of our sprays, you need to spray it days before a frost, and often we don't actually have, you're not going to know days before. So if you have to spray 5 days before the frost occurs, to know that that's going to happen is going to be difficult. So but yeah, there is some evidence to show, some independent research evidence to show that it will have some effect, but only if you get the timing right. And that's the kicker, really, getting that timing right. So Brett Cleggett has asked, what effect on bunches that are not flowering that the frost has taken the top of the canopy? So not a huge amount. So if the frost has just affected your first few leaves, but your inflorescences are not affected, hopefully you're not going to be all that badly affected. You're not going to have the leaves for the photosynthesis, so it may slow things down a little bit. If it's earlier in the season, it leaves your canopy a little bit more open as well. But yeah, hopefully if you've just had the tips of your shoots affected, but the inflorescences are fine, you should be okay. I've not done a lot of research in that area where we've left the inflorescences. We nearly always kill the inflorescences because I think generally if we're thinking the inflorescences haven't been hurt, you should be okay.
Okay, looks like that is it with regard to the Q&A. I'd like to first extend a big thank you to Sonja for presenting and for providing the content on such short notice. I'd also like to thank all the attendees who've logged in and joined in today's session. Apologies for some of those technical difficulties we were experiencing earlier, and thank you for your patience. The next AWRI webinar is this Thursday, and the topic for that session is sooty mould red winemaking trial, to be presented by the AWRI's Peter Godden. Paul, just to be clear, this will be recorded. This session is being recorded, and we will be making it available via our YouTube, by the AWRI YouTube channel later this afternoon. That's all we have for today. So thank you again for attending, and I look forward to seeing you again at the next AWRI webinar.